Hello everyone, this is Sam Spade and welcome to another tutorial in the Coding Fundamentals in GML 2.3 Update series. In this tutorial, we'll be talking about script functions versus method variables. Let's start with a review of what both of these things look like. Script functions follow the form function, then the name, then any arguments that you would want to include, and then the code of that function. A method variable is essentially two parts. It's an unnamed function, so creating an unnamed function with the form function, then the arguments, then the code that you want to be in that function, and assigning this function to a variable. So these are two separate parts: creation of the function, assigning it to the variable. But for this tutorial, we're going to call all of this the method variable. So this is how you create a script function, and this is how you create a method variable. So now I'm just going to give you a very simple rule. You should create script functions in script assets and nowhere else, and you should create method variables everywhere except script assets. Script assets get script functions, not a script asset, method variables. And really, it pretty much is as simple as this. If you follow these rules, you will be fine 99.9% of the time or more. But now let's talk about why this is the case. So method variables are variables that have been assigned a function and bound to an instance or a struct. The variables themselves have normal scope, whatever that variable scope would be, and then the functions have their own binding. And it's important to remember that what the function is bound to and the scope of the variable are not the same thing. Script functions are named functions that are global in scope with a script index. So they're a number, not a data type, or their data type is number, not a function. But you'll notice that I have two asterisks here. Why are these asterisks here? What do they mean? Well, in GameMaker, there are essentially two places where you write all of your code. Number one, you have script assets. Number two, you have objects. So when you combine the two ways to create functions with the two places to write code, you get this table. Putting script functions in script assets is incredibly useful. Putting method variables in objects is incredibly useful. This is total garbage. And putting method variables in script assets is kind of useful. Maybe. So if you remember from the script function tutorial, if you put a script function in a script asset, what you get is an unbound function that is global in scope. This means that any instance of any object anywhere in your game, or any other function for that matter, can call that function, that script function, and run it basically from inside of it, meaning a script function will have access to all of the variables inside of the instance or struct that is currently running that code. This makes script functions declared in script assets incredibly useful. Method variables, if you remember from the tutorial on method variables, are variables that hold a function where that variable has some type of scope, but more importantly for the purposes of this tutorial, the function is bound to something. When you create a function in this way, the function is bound in the scope that it was created in. So if you create it inside of an instance, it gets bound to that instance. If you create it inside of a struct, it gets bound to that struct. And this is very useful because you can put functions inside of instances, tie them to those instances, and even if you move the function around or other instances call it, it still operates on the instance that it is bound to. And it turns out that a method variable declared in a script asset is no different than a method variable declared in an object, but it is bound to the scope that it is created in. So you might have guessed at this point that what happens when you declare a method variable in a script asset is that the method variable itself is not only global, but the method is bound to the global context, which means that it can reference global variables without the global dot prefix in front of those variables. Personally, I think this has limited use. You can achieve the exact same result with a script asset that just references the variables with global dot, and I think this is more clear if you're reading the code. But in many ways, this is a case of personal preference. So that leaves us with what happens if you declare a script function inside of an object. And why is it total garbage? The reason is pretty straightforward. If you declare a script function inside of an object, it functions almost exactly like a method variable, but it has slightly less functionality and is much more confusing. So what I mean by that is if you declare a script function inside of an object, you will get a named function, just like you would if you were in a script asset. But unlike script functions declared in a script asset, which are unbound and global in scope, a script function declared in an object will be bound, just like a method variable, to the scope that it's created in, and has to be referenced like a variable, even though this is very unclear from the name. It also has the data type of number. But this will make a lot more sense if we just switch over to GameMaker Studio and demonstrate these four cases. So let's do that. Okay, so here we are in GameMaker. Over here, we have our script functions declared in our script asset. We talked about these again in the tutorial on script functions. Specifically, we talked about how named functions or script functions inside of a script asset can access the variables of the instance that is running them. So for example, this script function, add value to my variable, being declared in a script asset, can, if run from inside of an instance, access this variable. We also talked about how method variables, so a function declared as an unnamed function and then assigned to a variable, are bound when they are created. So this function right here, being created inside of an instance of object A, would be bound to object A. And regardless of where this function is called later on, it will operate on the variable, my variable, in object A, or the instance of object A that creates it. So these are the two forms that we've talked the most about in prior tutorials. Now let's talk about the other two forms. First, let's look at a method variable declared in a script asset. So we are using the unnamed function form. We're creating a function this way, and we're assigning it to a variable. The first thing to remember from the script assets tutorial is that all variables declared inside of a script asset will be global. So this variable right here will be global in scope. And if we want to use it later on, we'll have to use global.myMethod. The second thing, which we discussed with the slides, is because this is being declared at global scope, it is bound to the global scope, which means that it can operate on global variables without the global prefix. So we have these global variables up here, and regardless of where this function is called, it will be able to access these variables without using the global prefix. And then finally, we have named functions inside of an object. So here we have a function called add1 to my variable, which will simply add 1 to the variable, my variable. And as we said in the slides, what this is going to do is it's actually going to create a method variable that has this name and is still bound to this instance. So it will in effect be doing exactly what this function is doing, except that this variable will actually be a variable that has a type of method, and we'll see that in the debugger. And this script function will have a type of number. Before I run this, I want to go over a little bit of other code that we'll use. I have an object B, which simply takes the method that we declare over here in object A and assigns it to a variable that it holds. I've set it up in the room so that B is created after A, and there's only one version of object A, so we can reference it with the object ID rather than the instance ID. But this is just for demonstration purposes. You wouldn't normally want to write code like this. And then if we push the spacebar, object A will run global.myMethod, which remember, because this will be a global variable, if we want to run it, we need the global prefix. Then it will run my method, and note that we can repeat the names because this variable is bound to an instance of object A, whereas this variable is a global variable bound to the global scope. And then finally, we can call the function add1 to my variable. And this will work because it is basically a variable bound to object A. But then if we push enter in object B, it will call my method. Remember, this is the function that in the create event, it's actually the same method bound to object A. So instead of operating on object B, it will operate instead on object A. And then it will try to run add1 to my variable. And notice, and this is why I say that script functions declared in an instance or an object are complete trash, because GameMaker will actually recognize that this is a script function and will give you the syntax highlighting exactly as if it were declared inside of a script asset. But when we run this, it's actually going to error out the game. Object B does not have access to this. Only object A does. If we wanted to call this function from object B, we would actually have to use this syntax down here, where we are referencing the variable held by object A. And importantly, because this function is bound to object A, if we use this syntax, we would reference the variable in object A, not object B. Again, very different from what this function over here, the global unbound function, is doing. But let's just run this in the debugger and see what I mean. Okay, so I've run it in the debugger. The game is currently running, it's not paused, and I have real-time debugging turned on. And we can see that I have an instance of each object. So I have an instance of object A and an instance of object B. Object A has the variable, my variable. It also has the variable add1 to my method variable. So this is the script function that we declared. And note that unlike the script functions declared in the script asset, it is actually creating a variable inside of an instance of an object. Then we also have my method. This is a method variable. And then we have the two variables that we saved the type of these things to. So the method type has a type of method, but the script function type has the type of number. Because even though this variable holds a function that is in all respects acting exactly like this function, this data type is a number, not a method. And then of course in object B, we saved this method into object B. And you can see that by noting that these two numbers are the exact same. So if I click space, we can see that my variable has been incremented to 2. And if we look over here at the global variables, we can see that 675 has been incremented by 50, hello has been set to goodbye, and our array has picked a random number for 0. And every time I hit space, the same thing happens. I want to point out that the reason this variable is being increased by 2 is because both my method and add1 to my variable are incrementing it by 1. But now, if I hit enter, you can see that we got an error. Variable, unknown object, add1 to my variable. And that's because, again, this object B, or an instance of this object B, is trying to access this function, but it cannot, because despite looking like a global unbound function, it isn't. So in summary, create script functions in script assets and nowhere else, and create method variables everywhere else except for script assets. As always, the links in this slide will be below, along with links to the slides themselves and the source code. And that's it. Thanks for watching.